Evening, I'd like to take a look at what has to be one of the most important historical events for the nation of Israel. You know, for Christians, we would certainly point to the historical event of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ as absolutely fundamental concerning what our faith is based upon. If you could somehow prove that either the crucifixion or the resurrection, that it never really took place, that there was no evidence for it, it would certainly add a significant amount of doubt into our faith, and certainly make it difficult for us to substantiate the claims that we make concerning the salvation that we believe is centrally located upon the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. In fact, Paul tells the Corinthian church that if it wasn't for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we above all people would be most miserable. Why? Because there would be no evidence for the very central feature upon which we lay our hope. And for the nation of Israel, the establishment of the nation of Israel begins with their exodus from Egypt. Prior to that, they are the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They go in as a family and come out as a nation. And as we look into the world today, of course, the media is shaping the understanding of the world with a perspective of the nation of Israel as being illegal occupiers of the land of Palestine. And much of that, of course, has all kinds of political and religious undertones, but one of the things that is certainly difficult for establishing the right of Israel to be in the land, of course, is the very birth of the nation itself and its arrival ultimately under Joshua as he begins to occupy the promised land. If you could somehow disprove or cast serious question and doubt upon that situation and circumstance in terms of history, of course, you would be able to cause doubt on the legitimacy of the entire nation of Israel. In the same way in which if you could cast doubt on the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ, Paul was the one who said it, you would then really cast doubt on the veracity of Christianity in and of itself. And so in this study, we're going to be looking at the question of the evidence for the Exodus. Now, all of us are very familiar with the biblical account that the Bible gives us in the book of Exodus concerning this event, and there have been blockbuster movies made dramatizing this event. But is there any real evidence for it? Today, if you travel to the Sinai Peninsula, especially on one of the Holy Land tours, they will take you down to a mountain referred to as Jabal Musa, or Mount Sinai, the Mount of Moses. And there at the foot of the mountain is a monastery, St. Catherine's Monastery, which was established in the 4th century A.D. And the tradition of Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula really was something that was not established by the Jews, but by the Christians. And it was established in the 4th century through a very mystical type of a process. Now, if we look at this issue of where the children of Israel, if they indeed came out of Egypt, the key element, which is a repeated theme throughout Scripture, is the escape of Israel not only from Egypt, but the crossing of the Red Sea. It's equated in the Psalms as the symbol of God's salvation for the nation. In the New Testament, it is a type and shadow of you and I going through the waters of baptism. And so if it's an event associated around a historical event which cannot be proven, then it not only calls into question the veracity and the legitimacy of the nation of Israel, but one would have to question the legitimacy of Christianity itself, since it also bases so much in terms of types and shadows of really what we are as Christians, equated to like the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, crossing the Red Sea. Now, as we take a look at the place of the crossing, we find that they came out of Egypt and they turned in the wilderness, and they camped before the mouth of the channel between mountains and the sea, opposite Baal Zephon, which means the God of the unknown. After the crossing, they went 3 days' journey to the bitter springs of Marah. From there, they traveled on to Elim, where they found 12 wells and 70 palm trees, and they camped by the Red Sea. Then they turned inland and traveled through the wilderness of Sin, which is Hebrew for the word for thorns, and they came to Rephidim, a place where God will provide water from a rock. They then arrive at their camp at the foot of Mount Sinai. At the foot of Mount Sinai, there is the altar of Moses. There is the golden calf altar that was erected by the children of Israel, supervised by the brother of Moses. There would be a mountain that would have some evidence associated with it that the presence of God was there. These would be the evidences that we would look for. A place where, when they crossed, they would cross at a place where they turned in the wilderness and found themselves trapped. After they crossed 3 days' journey, they would find bitter springs, and then they would go and camp for a while by the Red Sea, and then ultimately turn into the wilderness, where God would then feed them with manna for their 40-year time in this wilderness area. Now, that being the criteria that one would look for, let's look at what the secular media has to say with regards to this. In the March 9th, 2002 issue of the New York Times, Dr. Zahi Hawass, the Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities and Director of the Giza Pyramid Excavation, says this: archaeologists who have worked here have never turned up evidence to support the account in the Bible. So, as the Sinai Peninsula now is residing under the control of Egypt, of course, the Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities for the nation of Egypt has made this broad brush statement concerning the claim of the Bible related to Israel, saying there's absolutely no evidence for the Exodus as it is described in the Bible. Now, I will caveat that by simply saying the Bible that most people have on their laps tonight. For as you turn to the back of most Bibles, of course, there will be a map there, which will make some type of delineation as to the travels of the children of Israel in this Sinai area. After the Six-Day War, the nation of Israel actually had the Sinai Peninsula, and during the time between its capture and delivering it back to Egypt after the Camp David Accord, during that time, Israel sent significant amounts of energy and money and individuals into the Sinai Peninsula, archaeologists, to try to see if they could discover anything that would corroborate the perceived exodus of the children of Israel and their residence on the Sinai Peninsula. And they found, as with this Egyptian general secretary, that they could not find not even one shard of pottery in the Sinai Peninsula that would really give any credence or any credibility to the story of the Exodus as it has been reported and taught for so many years within the church. David Wolf, the rabbi of the Sinai Temple in Los Angeles, California, who's assistant to the chancellor at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in New York. He is named as one of the 50 most influential Jews in America. What does he say? He writes, 3 years ago on Passover, I explained to my congregation that according to archaeologists, there was no reliable evidence that the Exodus took place, and that it almost certainly did not take place the way the Bible recounts it. Finally, I emphasize it didn't matter. Now, there you go. The fundamental proof text that God will not only declare in the historical account of Exodus, but he will make reference to it through the Psalms and the prophets as an example of God's sovereign ability to save and establish the nation of Israel. And yet experts today, both secular and Jewish, are in agreement that within the Sinai Peninsula and associated with all the traditions which have been established for more than 1,500 years, there's no evidence for the Exodus. Now, if we were to close our study now as this David Wolf did, we would go home quite depressed. Goodness gracious. Well, so much for that. Thanks. Rub a little salt in that wound. It's clear that secular experts say there is no evidence. But let's go back to the biblical text itself. What does the Bible say? Exodus chapter 13, verses 17 and 18 says this. Then it came to pass when Pharaoh had let the people go that God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. Now, in terms of this area here, the Sinai Peninsula is this land that predominantly lies between what we know as northwestern Saudi Arabia and western Jordan to the Gulf of Suez. That is the traditional area of what is referred to as the Sinai Peninsula. Now, it's been established that the area of Midian, the area where the father-in-law of Moses lived, is in northwest Saudi Arabia, and that there was a well-established trade route which went from Midian to the fertile Nile Delta, the land of Goshen, where the Israelis would have been encamped prior to their release from Pharaoh. That route would have taken them through the land of the Philistines. And so this quite possibly could have been the route of Moses after he is commissioned by God, when God speaks through the burning bush, telling Moses that he is to go before Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go. And so that's the best route that archaeologists can come up with regards to the natural pathway you would go from the land of Midian to the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel were residing and now have left because Pharaoh has let them go. In the back of most Bibles, of course, there are many different depictions of these various routes, and you'll notice that there's a lot of uncertainty. Now, here's a map that's on the back, in the back pages of my Bible, and it will display a number of different types of routes that could be taken, but you'll notice that anything that is associated with the Exodus itself has a question mark next to it. And as soon as you see a question mark in a Bible, you should know that the experts aren't really willing to make an absolute statement with regards to it. We know that they left the area of Goshen, which is the eastern portion of the Nile Delta. There are some scholars that believe that their first obstacle was to cross through not the Red Sea, but the Reed Sea. It always amuses me when I hear people make a huge thing of, well, you need to understand that one of the ways the Hebrew can be translated is reed rather than red, and therefore they cross through the Reed Sea. There is a marshy area that did exist at that time, and it was a large area where reeds would grow. And of course, I love to quip, then if the children of Israel did not cross the Red Sea, but the Reed Sea, of course, then that would mean that Pharaoh's entire army drowned in a foot of water, which is even a greater miracle. But the Reed Sea is a very common statement that people will make in trying to explain the biblical text. The next is that they actually went north to a place called Baal-zephon, which not quite sure from antiquity whether that is a name that was given to it because it is a convenient connection with the biblical account. But nonetheless, it's a small area where there are a few lakes, and so they feel that the children of Israel went north and crossed one of these small lakes at Baal-zephon. Of course, there is also this position whereby they cross the northern part of, in your Bible, the Red Sea. Notice what we know as the Gulf of Suez. Most Bibles will call that the Red Sea, and then to the east of the Sinai Peninsula, they will refer to that as the Gulf of Aqaba. From there, the traditional route is they go 3 days from the crossing, and they come to the bitter springs of Marah. Notice the question mark, because when you travel to this area of Egypt today, of course, there's no evidence of there ever being any type of source of water there. So they make up all kinds of different reasons for that to be so. But there's no rock formations, there's no any kind of geological information that would lend you or make you believe that previously there was some type of body of water there. Then, of course, they go to an area of Elam, where there's supposed to be 12 wells and 70 palm trees. And, of course, yet again, it's an area on the map where when you visit that today, there is nothing there. And there's nothing to indicate there ever was anything there. Then, of course, they travel down to what we know as the tip, near the tip of Mount Sinai, to Jebel Musa. That is the traditional view which is represented in most Bibles. And that is the view that both secular and Jewish historians have refuted. And thus, if you place the basis of your faith in the Bible upon an inaccurate representation of the truth, of course you can refute it. That would be like saying there's no proof that Jesus Christ was crucified in London, because London didn't exist then, or whatever. I mean, you picked the wrong place on planet Earth. Of course you're not going to find the evidence for it. First, let's take a look at this as geologists would. The Red Sea is a sea which has two northern gulfs. To the west, the Gulf of Suez. To the east, the Gulf of Aqaba. They are both considered the Red Sea. The problem that you have with this Sinai Peninsula solution, which has been traditional for 1,500 years, is there's no archaeological evidence there. There's no geographical evidence there. The northern Sinai region at that time had a significant Egyptian military presence. In fact, during the time of Abraham, Abraham referred to an area between the region of the Philistines and Egypt as the wilderness of Shur. In other words, that is a Hebrew term that speaks of a fortified area between the two lands. Another item that you need to make reference to is that Moses was returning to Mount Horeb, which we refer to as Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, and it was in Midian. Midian was never on the Sinai Peninsula. The Midianites did not live in the land of Egypt. The Midianites were a nomadic people that lived in northwestern Saudi Arabia. And the real clincher for me is the Bible itself tells us where Mount Sinai is. The Apostle Paul writes to the Galatians and tells them in chapter 4, verse 25, "For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia." Now, I think he's a little closer to the heart of the subject with regards to the location of the real Mount Sinai than mystics 400 years later, who believe that they were establishing sacred sites by mysticism rather than historic proof. In fact, when you travel to Israel today, I love to quip when people go with me and say, if they built a church over it, probably nothing happened there. Because I found none of the traditional sites to really have any real historical evidence associated with any of the places. Paul ought to know, because we are told in Paul's own words that he goes to the backside of the wilderness where he spent 3 years being taught directly by God. And most Bible commentators believe that Paul, after his conversion in Damascus, went down into the land of Midian, probably went to Mount Horeb, the same place where Elijah fled and resided after his confrontation with the prophets of Baal and then the threatening of Jezebel. But Galatians says that this Mount Sinai is in Arabia. If the destination is Mount Horeb in Midian, then we need to examine, then where did the children of Israel cross the Red Sea? Now, if Midian is in southwest Saudi Arabia today, then let's look at the biblical account of the night before the event, where we're given some very interesting and specific details about the camp of Israel before they make the crossing. We read in verses 1 to 2, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, that they turn and camp before Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, opposite Baal-Zephon. You shall camp before it by the sea." Now, you and I immediately look at that and think, well, that's a lot of information. I wonder if in the wilderness, if there were just a lot of signs. Well, of course not. The place of the crossing is a place which we first need to understand the timing of the crossing. It will help us understand how far they were in their travels. And it's one of the ways in which you can refute the idea of a few days out of the land of Goshen. They crossed the northern part of this Gulf of Suez, or the Reed Sea, even further north than that. We know from Exodus chapter 19, verse 1, that they arrive at the foot of Mount Horeb, that is Sinai, after about 48 days. The Jews, of course, say they arrive there and are consecrated before God at 50 days. And therefore, that's why they say that the Feast of Pentecost is the feast which celebrates the birth of the nation of Israel, as they are consecrated before God at the foot of Mount Sinai. Interesting, isn't it? They claim Pentecost as the birth of the nation of Israel. The church claims Pentecost as the day of the birth of the church, both taking place 50 days after the deliverance of the nation of Israel. We're told in Exodus chapter 16 that they arrive in Midian 30 days after leaving the land of Goshen. So it takes them 18 days to go from arriving in Midian until they arrive at the foot of Mount Sinai. Therefore, we know, since it took them 3 days to find the springs of bitter water, and then some time after that until they reside at Elim, where there's the 12 springs and the 70 palms where they camp by the Red Sea, about 25 days after they leave the land of Goshen, they arrive at the crossing point. Now, let's take a look now at this area and speak about the Red Sea. The Red Sea itself is part of the Great African Rift. Its maximum depth is about 9,000 feet, about 3,000 meters deep. The Gulf of Suez, that portion of the Red Sea which protrudes north and westerly from the Red Sea, the average width is about 20 miles and the depth is between 200 and 300 feet. The Gulf of Aqaba ranges from 8 to 17 miles wide, and the depth is greater than 2,000 feet, in some areas 4,600 feet, much deeper. Now let's look at the 4 key descriptions again that we read in Exodus chapter 14, verses 1 to 2. We are told that they turn. The context there is they are traveling in the area from Ethan. They turn. They make a sudden turn from the direction they were going. They camp before Pi-hahiroth, which means in Hebrew, mouth of the channel. Number 3, they are to camp between Migdol and the sea. The word Migdol in Hebrew just simply means a mighty tower or fortress. Now, there certainly was no fortress there, but let me put it to you this way. If you were a Jew and you had lived your entire life on a plain, on a delta, all you would see is flat. You wouldn't know what a mountain was. But as you come to the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula, or you go through the region of the Sinai Peninsula, there are some exceedingly high mountains there. So we see that they are to turn suddenly, they are to camp before the mouth of the channel, and they are to camp between the tower or the fortress or the mountains and the sea. And it is to be opposite Baal Zephon. Baal Zephon, which means God of the north or God of the unknown. So pretty specific as to where this crossing takes place. Now, of course, the idea of the crossing at the Red or the Reed Sea, of course, none of those 4 specifics come to play there. They're focused so much on trying to force fit the interpretation of the Hebrew into the text that they then don't put it in the context of the entire passage. Again, for the position of crossing the northern Suez, the Gulf of Suez, again, there are none of these features. It is certainly not at the mouth of the channel, and there is nothing that would be referred to as the God of the unknown, which would be on the other side. There's another place that is being proposed at a place called Nueba, and we'll examine that in a little detail. It was proposed by an explorer named Ron Wyatt. who did some extensive work in this area and has proposed Nuweiba as a possible place for the crossing of the children of Israel into the land of Midian. And then there are those who believe that the crossing could take place at the Straits of Tiran, at the very opening of this gulf into the main body of the Red Sea. So having dismissed the first two suggestions, the Reed Sea or the North Suez, let's take a look now at two of the solutions that take us across the Gulf of Aqaba, remembering that this is a gulf that is some 2,000 feet deep, and at places as much as 4,600 feet deep. Now at Nuweiba, there's a very interesting outcropping, a beach that exists that sort of juts out of this area. And the idea is that the children of Israel, as they were traveling across the north, when they came to the land of the Philistines, suddenly turned south and began to travel south, and they found themselves what would effectively be a box canyon. They would exit from the mountains themselves onto this huge sandy beach area, and there would be nowhere to go. There's also another very interesting facet about this particular place, that as you examine this location, it just so happens that below the surface, at this portion of the Gulf of Aqaba, there is an underwater land bridge. It resides under the water, about 200 feet below the water. There's a gentle slope that leaves the western bank and then goes along and comes up, as though it was a highway put under the sea. It was Ron Wyatt who, on the Nuweiba side, noticed there was this peculiar pillar that was there with no inscription. And according to his own reports, when he traveled to the Saudi Arabian side, that he found another pillar, only this one had inscribed on it the place of the crossing. When he was arrested, for he was there in Saudi Arabia, he sort of snuck in through Jordan. They thought he was an Israeli spy. When he finally convinced them he wasn't a spy, that he was a biblical archaeologist, to prove his point, he took Saudi Arabian scholars out to this place, and apparently, according to his own writing, showed them this pillar, and the Saudi Arabians immediately took it down for safekeeping. Now, no pictures have ever been produced of it other than the report of Ron Wyatt. But he was also one who did some research with regards to what he believes are the very chariot wheels and axles of Pharaoh's invading army that were buried in the sea. For along this peninsula, underwater peninsula, there are various elements of wreckage which he purports to be evidence of the remaining evidence of the Egyptians there. Now, I must tell you that there is significant questions with regards to the veracity of this and the accuracy of this. There is lots, as the rest of the sea is so deep. This is a very popular and has been since ancient times a place where ancient vessels went back and forth. There is a lot of evidence of lots of wreckage there from thousands of years of maritime use of this area. And so that's a bit unconclusive. But it is provocative. Certainly the land bridge makes it very provocative. Let's look at the fourth alternative, the alternative there of the Straits of Tiran. Now, when you examine the western shore of the Sinai Peninsula, you'll see that there is a large sandy area that goes clear up unto the area of the land of Goshen. It would have been easy to travel south along this line, but notice the idea there is that as they traveled down, they then came to a place where they no longer could continue walking along the sea. The idea is that there would be a place of the crossing there at the Straits of Tiran. Now again, remember these four key descriptions. They turned from Ethan, meaning a turn in the wilderness. They camped by Pi-hahiroth, the mouth of the channel. They were between Migdol and the sea, meaning the tower or fortress, the mountains that were there, opposite Baal-zephon, meaning the god of the north. Now, as we look at this area, there are some, again, very interesting features concerning this. First of all, as you go to this particular area at the tip of the Sinai Peninsula, it's a very popular place for scuba diving because there is so much under the surface there. And you'll notice opposite the main landmass, there are a number of very large islands. And there is the belief that as you stand, or is the practice that as you stand on the Sinai Peninsula and you look eastward and you look at these islands, for ancient mariners, as they would sail from the safety of being able to see land, the last bit of land they would see would be this island that is in the middle of this opening of the Gulf of Aqaba. And there is some belief by archaeologists that this was being referred to as the God of the unknown, that as they went past this last piece of land, now sailing into the main body of the Red Sea, they would commit themselves to the God of the unknown. And there would be sacrifices that would actually be partaken of there. But another thing that's interesting about this particular place is there is also an underwater land bridge that goes from this place at the tip of Mount Sinai to the beginning of Saudi Arabia. In fact, when you travel there today at low tide, you will see the residual of it. There's a coral reef there, which is a favorite spot for divers. And this land bridge is a little under 100 feet under the water. And of course the coral has grown up to the point to where it's now almost at sea level. And there's some very interesting photographs. You ever want to just Google and look at images from the Straits of Tiran, you can see many of these people who love to scuba dive and snorkel around this area. They can go out into the middle of the Straits of Tiran, and at low tide they can actually stand in waist-high water. And they're on the firm ground that is there as a result of the coral reef. So we have there two options within this very deep portion of water, the Gulf of Aqaba, where the children of Israel could have crossed over, God leaving the residual of either one of these places a land bridge. The pathway in the sea, we are told, Exodus chapter 15, verse 8, and with the blast of your nostrils, the waters were gathered together, the flood stood upright like a heap, the depths congealed in the heart of the sea. The dividing of the Red Sea is something that is presented often in Scripture in Psalm 66, 74, 77, 104, 106, Nehemiah 9. It's recounted in an amazing number of places. It's not something that could be trivial. It's referred to as a heap, not a trickle. It was a tremendous feat of God, for it marked the separation of the children of Israel from their captors in Egypt. Now remember, their destination is Mount Horeb. They were to cross the Red Sea, and after the crossing, they would travel 3 days to Marah, the place of the bitter springs. Verse 22 and 23, so Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea Then they went into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Now when they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah. Now in this northwestern portion of Saudi Arabia, leaving from the Straits of Tiran, there's been two individuals who've explored this area to a reasonable level. There was two individuals, Bob Kernook and Larry Williams, who went to this area of Saudi Arabia and went 30 kilometers into the wilderness, which would equate to about a 3-day journey. And lo and behold, they found, even now, they found the residual of bitter springs. This area, the soil is very porous, and therefore the brackish water would be the result of the Salton Sea impregnating the aquifer, the source of clean water in this southern tip of the region of Saudi Arabia, in the area of Midian. But there was another explorer who made the same journey, only he went along the coast, went 3 days' journey, and again found what was obviously springs that were still producing bitter water, undrinkable, brackish water. We then know from there that they then camped at Elim, where there were 12 wells and 70 palm trees. And then we are told, then they camped by the Red Sea. When Bob Kernook and Larry Williams continued their journey, they traveled again about another 30 kilometers, and they found an ancient oasis. This is an image from Google Earth of this particular area. And there today is an ancient oasis. When you read his book, Mountain of God, he actually has photographs of 12 ancient wells that are in keeping with the story of the Exodus. But this other explorer also went a short distance north and came to the city of El Makna along the coast of the Gulf of Aqaba, and there discovered an area which also has 12 ancient wells and is still today producing enough water to supply the needs of the entire city. There's a significant city that's there, El Makna. We are told in the account that they went from there, camped by the Red Sea. That's one of the problems I have with the Bob Kernook, Larry Williams solution, is you can't get back to the Red Sea from there very easily. They went from the Red Sea, and then we are told they turned into the wilderness of Sin. And they came to Rephidim, where there was water from the rock. Chapter 17, Exodus. Then all the congregation of the children of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sin, according to the commandment of the Lord, and they camped in Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they moved from Elim inland. Now, this area of Midian is an area which receives a cumulative rainfall over 10 years of less than 1/4 inch, 5 millimeters of water cumulative every 10 years. It's an incredibly dry area. Now, in front of this area, there is a mountain ridge, which at this point we're going to identify as Mount Horeb. And we'll show you evidence that on the other side, the eastern side of this, is actually a good candidate for the camp of Sinai. Now, the word Rephidim means a resting place. God takes them into the middle of a desert where nothing can live and says, now this is the place you're going to rest. It's strange that God would take him to such a environmentally hostile place for them to rest. On the way, they would have passed through what today is the city of Al-Bad. It is referred to as the city of Midian or the city of Jethro, the father-in-law today. The people that live in Al-Bad refer to it as the city of Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses. In fact, west of the city is an ancient well that they refer to as the Well of Moses. You remember the story of Moses when he arrives in the land of Midian. He sees the daughters of Jethro struggling, and he goes and he waters the flocks of the daughters of Jethro. So the people who live in this area refer to this ancient well as the Well of Moses. From there, they go up into an area where there is an ancient lake bed. Now, did you hear me? A lake bed in the middle of the Saudi Arabian desert that gets less than 1/4 inch cumulative rain every 10 years. We are told that when they arrive at this place in the wilderness, that God tells Moses to strike the rock under the presence of God. God goes and resides over a particular rock and says, now strike this rock. Psalm 78 tells us in verses 15 to 16, he split the rock in the wilderness and gave them drink in abundance like the depths. He also brought streams out of the rock and caused water to run down like rivers. There was a family called the Caldwells that lived in Saudi Arabia, I think more than 10, it might be even 14 years. And they did some significant research in this particular area. For further information, I would recommend that you visit their website, www.splitrockresearch.com. They have some further information and booklets. But while they were there in the country, they would take each of their holidays to this region because they were looking for the evidence of the Exodus. And they were the ones in this area to find an amazing feature. For there in the midst of this ancient lake bed is a rock formation that stands upright and is 6 stories high. When you look at this feature on Google Earth, there its longitude and its latitude, this satellite imagery indicates that there is a shadow that dwarfs anything around it, thus being able to determine that the height of this is at least 6 stories high. Massive rock. What's interesting about this rock is that, first of all, not only is it perched in a peculiar sort of a way to be found in the middle of a desert arid area, but there is a split down the middle of the rock. If that's not peculiar enough, at the base of the rock, at the bottom of the split, there is the obvious evidence of water erosion. It's in an area of less than 1/4 inch of rain every 10 years. And that as they go down from this rock, all of the rock around it is smooth. Now, when you have rock that's exposed to desert arid climates, if you've ever been around an arid place, the heat cracks the rocks, and all the rocks are sharp, unless the sand blows over them and smooths them. But for the most part, you can tell whether or not it's been worn by sand or not. The rocks around the base of this 60-foot tall split rock are all washed with water. If that wasn't peculiar enough, you need to recognize this is an area in Saudi Arabia where there is no evidence of any civilization near it. There's no evidence of villages, and yet the Caldwells discovered around this site ancient inscriptions of feet. Now, if you were going to leave a marker somewhere, would you leave an inscription of your foot? Well, what they left was these inscriptions. Apparently, according to their own writings, the Caldwells say that they found dozens of these stones, these rock inscriptions with footprints. What's significant about that? Well, if you remember, God will tell the nation of Israel that when they enter the promised land, God will give them all the land that they place their foot on. These are the anticipatory markers of their home. Not only that, around this site, they found devices for grinding grain. How about manna? By this time, the nation of Israel was being fed manna. All around this site, around the rim of this ancient lake bed, they found the evidence of humans there grinding stones. The scriptures then tell us that from there they went to the camp of Sinai. The area that we're going to look at here is an area which is about 1 mile in diameter. Why is that significant? Because most Bible scholars believe that there was anywhere from 1 to 3 million people in the children of Israel at the time of the Exodus. They had over 600,000 men of war. One of the problems you have when you go to the traditional site in the Sinai Peninsula, of course, is you arrive there and realize, wow, there's not room for 3 million, there's not room for 300,000, there's not room for 30,000. They couldn't live here. In this particular area, there's a nice big flat area in which there are many different archaeological sites. Again, you can view all this using Google Earth. There's large fenced-off areas. And according to the Caldwells, they visited one of these sites and saw that there were significant evidence for dwellings there. And they found ancient grave sites. You remember when Moses comes down from Mount Sinai and he sees what the children of Israel had done, that they had made this golden calf and they were worshiping it and playing harlotry before it, that he took it, he ground up the gold, put it in the water and made them drink it, and many died. Well, what have they found there? They have found ancient gravesite, and they've found a significant repository of gold in the middle of the desert. It's one of the reasons why the Saudi government doesn't want anybody doing digs there. The nation of Israel were also told that they were to make boundary markers around the base of the mountain. And it was first Bob Cornuke and Larry Williams traveling to this area, and also the Caldwells, who found and photographed many different types of boundary markers, man-made pillars. And they surround the base of the mountain at this point. Exodus 24, 4-5 tells us, Moses wrote all the words of the Lord, and he arose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent young men of the tribe of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. So another feature that we should find there should be the altar at the foot of the mountain. Well, if you go west of this camp where there are these interesting archaeological digs, you will come to a feature which again you can see using Google Earth, which looks like a man-made feature. A closer inspection of it, a picture taken by the Caldwells, reveals a facility which appears to be An altar. Now, you and I, when we think of an altar, unfortunately suffer from what really is Sunday school-itis. We've seen those little stick drawing pictures of a little thing built up out of stone, and you lay an animal on it and you sacrifice it. That's the altar. Nice idea, but let me ask you this question. Would you be able to grab an oxen and slit its throat and put it on an altar? Don't think so. The way you slaughter animals is you drive them into a facility where they can no longer turn. And when they get to the end of the facility, then you kill them, and then you take them and put them into the place where the sacrifice will take place. This is a drawing from the Saudi Arabian Department of Archaeology, and they diagram what they refer to as either a quarry, a residence, or an altar. At the end of this V-shaped facility, there is a place of ancient ash. Now, when you consider the fact that in Saudi Arabia itself, the religions there did not practice animal sacrifice. Therefore, it would not be logical to assume that that which was built here was of Saudi Arabian origin. And that they've identified ancient ash would lend credence to the idea that it was not a place of someone's residence where their refuge would go away. It was something of some significance, and it's a big facility. We're told that the children of Israel, when they arrived there, they received the 10 Commandments. The children of Israel are consecrated before God. They have this altar of Moses. But then, of course, Exodus chapter 32, they have this experience where they erect a man-made altar and place upon it a golden calf. And Aaron said, "This is your gods that brought you out of Egypt." Well, again, associated with this area in Saudi Arabia, to the east of the camp of Israel, there's a very interesting rock outcropping. This photograph taken by Bob Kernook in 1998. It's a huge man-made altar. You'll see that it is a man-made structure. It is now surrounded by a very high chain-link fence. Before it was placed off limits, the Caldwells actually went to this altar and photographed rock etchings around the altar, and they found ancient Egyptian images of cattle. They're called bovine petroglyphs. And they found these inscribed around this altar. And when they counted the number of bovine characters, they found that there were 12 of them. Read that, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. When you consider the fact that, again, there were no worship of the ox in Saudi Arabia, peculiar that such a facility would exist, first of all, in an area of the desert which was not associated with any town or village. It seems to be completely in isolation. Finally, we are told that this place was before Mount Sinai. We read in chapter 19, verse 8, "Now Mount Sinai was completely in smoke because the Lord descended upon it. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly." There's an interesting feature about this particular area, and you can see it even from Google Earth, The predominant stone in this area is pink granite, a light pink granite. It's a very hard rock. And it was Bob Kernook who brought back photographs of the tip of this, where people thought, oh, it must be a result of the shadow of some cloud. But what they later found was, no, there is actually a line on the ground that surrounds this area. It was Bob Kernook who, in his book, The Mountain of Fire, writes that he was able to take out of the country some samples of rock from this area and had it independently verified by a lab in New York City, who confirmed that it was granite, but the outside of it had been placed in a furnace, as if the outside had been melted. When you take a look at the evidence for the Exodus, the place of the crossing needs to be a place where they turned in the wilderness. They need to camp before the mouth of the channel between the mountains and the sea, opposite Baal Zephon. After the crossing, they need to travel 3 days' journey to a bitter springs and then on to Elim, where there are 12 wells and 70 palm trees. They need to have camped by the Red Sea. They need to go through the wilderness of Sin to the Rephidim, where they receive water in the wilderness from a rock. They need to camp at the foot of Mount Sinai, where there will be an altar of Moses, a golden calf altar, and a burnt mountain. The evidence for the Exodus indeed exists. The reason why the secular skeptics find themselves so proud of what they've been able to disprove is they're disproving a site that never was the place of the Exodus. I believe the place of the Exodus is still preserved by God, and that the evidence that is there because God is true to his word. Sadly, it is the Saudi Arabian Department of Archaeology that is preventing any independent verification of any of this. But it's kind of hard to argue with the pictorial evidence which has been obtained of this area, especially in comparing it to any other of the alternatives which fill most Bible commentaries concerning the Exodus of the children of Israel. So rather than be like those who say, oh, well, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter, it does matter. And God has left the evidence for us so that our faith is built on something that is solid. Let's close with prayer. Father, we're grateful that you have not called us to an unreasonable faith. Lord, that you have left before us, if we look in the right areas, Lord, that which does give substance to our faith. We're grateful, Lord, for the work that has been done by those who have gone before us, who've risked their very lives to bring us the images that we now look at, to point out in the direction of this exciting evidence. And Lord, we pray for the ongoing research in this area. Lord, that you'd open an opportunity for us to be able, Lord, for the people seeking truth to be able to really verify and examine this area in more detail. Lord, that you would continue to protect that which appears to us as good evidence for the Exodus of Israel. For it's in your name we pray. Amen.